Good afternoon. First of all, let me wish you Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova, and thank the INSS and Oded in particular for arranging this conference. This is exactly the right moment to be reflecting on issues of great importance with respect to history, but also those that, as we're going to talk about later in the program, have applicability to what we're facing today. Until now, you've heard discussions of decision-making in Washington and Jerusalem. You've heard how the U.S.-Israeli relationship evolved during this period. I've been asked to look at the third side of the triangle, the evolution of the U.S.-Egyptian strategic relationship. What I want to do then for the next few minutes is look at this through three time frames: the period immediately before and after the 1973 war, the long period of Hosni Mubarak's presidency starting in 1981 and coming to an end in 2011, and then to raise some questions with respect to where the relationship is going as a result of the changes in Egypt. Because of the nature of the program, I'm going to focus mostly on the first set of questions. And in that regard, I want to take issue with some of what I might call the conventional narrative about the evolution of Sadat's thinking and the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. According to that prevailing narrative, Sadat came to a strategic conclusion, probably sometime in the early part of his presidency, 1971, 1972, that the United States effectively held all the cards in the Middle East, and that therefore, without knowing that 20 years later the Soviet Union would collapse, therefore it would be important for Egypt to align its strategic interests with those of the United States. This decision, whenever it was taken in this period, came against the backdrop of growing frustration that Sadat had experienced with his relationship with the Soviet Union regarding, at one point, the withholding of arms, and the question that Sadat had as whether the Soviets would agree to his political military strategy for dealing with the occupation of Sinai and other territories from the 1967 war. In this period, which Bill Quandt and now all of us call the period of standstill diplomacy, Sadat's domestic position was very weak. It was exacerbated by a growing feeling among the Egyptian people that he was not up to the task of governing, and certainly did not measure up to his predecessor, Gamal Abdel Nasser, as leader. Sadat, in fact, had inherited a much weakened Egypt. Nasser had left Egypt almost bankrupt. Political forces that Sadat had defeated in 1971 in the so-called corrective movement in May of that year were still a threat. The Egyptian economy was in terrible shape, and the army and a significant part of the Egyptian public were agitating for Sadat to do something that would exercise his leadership vis-a-vis the occupation of Egyptian territory. And against this backdrop, Sadat declared 1971 to be the year of decision, and we've heard from our previous speakers, and we'll continue talking about it today, what that meant in practical terms. Sadat, as we have heard, tried diplomacy in this period. There were peace feelers not taken seriously by the United States or Israel. There was frustration on the part of Sadat. And the conventional narrative, therefore, holds that the United States, not taking Sadat seriously, was much more intensely interested in cementing its strategic relationship with Israel. In fact, it was during this period, after the 1967 war, that the Israeli-U.S. strategic relationship matured. The United States became Israel's main arms supplier, supplanting France. The United States became more interested in what we have just heard, the peace process, although we initially deferred to the United Nations and the envoy of the United Nations, Gunnar Jarring. We tried our own peace process in 1969, but as you heard, the United States was beset by internal competition between our State Department and our White House. And so even the beginning of the peace process in that period ended up not having much impact. It was during this period that President Nixon articulated what became known as the Nixon Doctrine, which, while normally understood to be focused primarily on Iran as a regional surrogate or proxy power in place of the United States, was applied in practice to Israel as well. Henry Kissinger clearly saw Israel's military power and the U.S.-Israeli military relationship as an important component of the Nixon administration's Cold War strategy, made even more urgent because U.S. resources were strained as a result of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Indeed, as the author Edward Sheehan has noted, Kissinger, quote, helped to promote the conventional strategic wisdom of the first Nixon administration that in the absence of fruitful negotiations, a strong Israel, militarily much superior to its Arab foes, would prevent war and serve as the surest sentinel of American interests in the Middle East. In Kissinger's own words, in a briefing to Congress in early 1974, he said, quote, it is in our American interest to have Israel so strong that the Arabs can't defeat it, so they must come to us for progress. The points of Egyptian-American strategic convergence in this analysis are critical to understand. For the United States, diminishing the Soviet role in the Middle East was an encompassing objective that underpinned virtually everything that the Nixon administration did during this period. For Sadat, diminishing Soviet influence was not necessarily a problem, though it was not a strategic objective. For the United States, finding a credible ally in the form of the largest, most influential, and most powerful Arab state was a strategic goldmine worth pursuing. For Sadat, achieving some degree of balance in America's relations with Israel was worth the price of what he hoped would be temporary alienation from the Arab world. For the United States, achieving incremental progress toward peace between Egypt and Israel would constitute a major foreign policy success. For Sadat, the goal seemed to be peace with the United States, in a sense far more importantly than peace with Israel. The accepted conventional history of this period, thus, is important to understand, but it may need some enrichment. It is accurate to say that no one took Sadat's early peace initiatives seriously. But in retrospect, it is not clear at all why both the United States and Israel were so dismissive. Neither thought very highly of Sadat's leadership in this period before the 73 war, and neither assumed that he would be long in office. But it is curious that no one paid attention, or few paid attention, to the strategic impossibility of Egypt's allowing its territory to remain occupied and taking no action at all. Sadat did not come lightly to the decision to try out a peace initiative with the United States. He had agreed in 1971 to the conclusion of a Soviet-Egyptian friendship treaty. It was a desperate effort to stabilize what I described earlier as a challenging domestic situation. He needed the Soviets more than ever to help him with arms and economic assistance to deal with the economic crisis at home and with the challenge that he felt was being posed to his own leadership by opponents who still were trying to marshal opposition to him. These objectives for Sadat were not easily secured. In March 1972, notwithstanding that treaty of friendship, the Soviets demanded full payment for the arms they were delivering, and they wanted full payment in hard currency, which Sadat didn't have. Domestic unrest in that period was growing, exacerbated by the growing and accurate perception that Sadat was in fact unraveling Nasser's program in the social and economic realms. Sadat turned to the Arabs who in fact supported him, but as they are wont to do, supported him primarily rhetorically more than actually. However, in the short term, and notwithstanding these challenges, Sadat emerged from at least some of these crises on better terms, or so it seemed. The Soviets began to increase the flow of arms, and Sadat believed as a result of this that the Soviets would become more amenable to his military political strategy. What needs more nuance, however, is to understand what underpins Sadat's thinking and what later came to underpin the responsive thinking of the United States leadership. Because far more than in almost any other relationship between a superpower and a regional power, the critical factor in this emerging relationship became the personal interaction between the leaders, between Sadat and Kissinger, and ultimately between Sadat and American presidents. Nixon and Kissinger became absolutely fascinated with the personality and diplomacy of Anwar Sadat. Kissinger told a bipartisan congressional leadership meeting in 1974, quote, "Compare Nasser and Sadat. Nasser had a mystique, but he was persona non grata with conservative Arabs. We underestimated Sadat," Nixon said, "because he didn't have the charisma. He didn't have the debt to the radicals either, the utter hatred of Israel." Kissinger echoed this. He said, quote, "Nasser was a pan-Arabist, Sadat an Egyptian nationalist, better able to lead the Arabs. Nasser," Kissinger said, "scared the Arabs silly. Sadat's wisdom was indispensable. His willingness and his patience gave us time to get things turned around." From his side, Sadat also assiduously cultivated the personal relationship with American leaders and with each of the four presidents with whom he interacted: Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. In the words of Kissinger, quote, "Sadat treated Nixon as a great statesman, Ford as the living manifestation of goodwill, Carter as a missionary almost too decent for this world, and Reagan as the benevolent leader of a popular revolution, subtly appealing to each man's conception of himself and gaining the confidence of each." Sadat, for his part, never masked his strategy or his views about the United States and the Soviet Union. When he later met President Nixon in Salzburg in 1975, he said the following: "I want you to look at me as a friend. If the United States cannot do something, I will not be able to defend the United States again because Israel gets everything it needs from the United States. I want good relations with the United States. I will be very disappointed if nothing can be achieved, Mr. President," Sadat said. "We have gone beyond where any Arab has gone in the past. My people will be very disappointed if nothing can be achieved. I want us to make progress, to make a complete peace." 1975. According to Mohammed Hassan and Haikal, as we know, a key confidant of Nasser, who persisted in a leadership role for at least some of the years of Sadat's presidency, Sadat was willing to undertake major changes in Egypt's orientation in at least 5 critical areas. Number one, that only the United States would get or could get Israel to withdraw from the territories that were occupied in 1967. Number two, in Sadat's thinking, the Soviet Union's presence and influence needed to be, if not removed, at least diminished in the region. 3, that Egypt would engage in no more wars with Israel. 4, that Egypt would need the equivalent of a Marshall Plan to rescue its economy, but this would only come as a result of a combination of American aid and investment and Arab oil money. And 5th, that Egypt needed a new strategic axis. No longer Cairo, Damascus, the PLO, but rather Cairo, Riyadh, Tehran, and Washington. Haikal goes on to explain how Sadat came to this strategic concept, although Haikal describes this change in rather dismissive and derogatory terms. In Haikal's view, which he ascribes to Nasser, Egypt's strategic interests, as shaped by geography and history, lie to the south and to the east. Nasser had understood that in order to secure Egypt's interests, the country needed an alternative to the Western, or what the Western powers called, the Middle East concept, a system developed by the West that saw the region as nothing more than a chain of alliances to curb Soviet power and ambitions. Nasser tried to create this alternative Arab system based on unity of language, culture, and religion, among other things, and he had used what he called the threat from Israel as a motivator to cement this Arab system. According to Heikel, Sadat should have seen the 1973 war in those terms, and he should have seen that the war validated the Arab system, for it had challenged and had successfully challenged Israel's security doctrine, and it had given lie to the American assumption that Israel could act as a surrogate power for the United States. Sadat, however, had a different concept in mind. He abandoned the idea of the Arab system and chose instead to throw Egypt's lot in with the West. He did this, as I've noted, because of the staggering internal economic problems and the collapse of Egypt's infrastructure. But it's interesting that Heikel's assessment makes, in some respects, far more sense for Egypt's interests than Sadat's assessment did at the time. For Sadat at the time gambled with Egyptian interests in a high-stakes game that had no sure outcome. Given Egypt's long-standing definition of its national and regional interests, there was no rational reason for Sadat to believe that he could insert himself and Egypt into the United States-Israel alliance and to come out a winner. In the end, Sadat, of course, did come out a winner, if not exactly on equal footing, but in large measure as part of this new triangle of Egyptian, American, Israeli understanding. Finally, in this period, we need to integrate one additional factor, as we've heard earlier in the discussion, and that is the impact of U.S.-Soviet détente on Egypt's interest, strategy, and intention to recover its territory. In this respect, the traditional narrative holds that the United States was surprised by Egypt's decision to expel the Soviet advisors in 1972. Kissinger himself and many scholars accept the idea that the move was unexpected and that it, in effect, validated the concept of détente. This view, however, is not the whole story. Drawing on declassified American documents, scholars such as Craig Dagley have said, through the summer of 1971, the Nixon administration took numerous steps to help Sadat remove the Soviet military from the presence of his territory. He cites Nixon's decision to suspend the delivery of arms to Israel for a period of time, and, as we heard earlier today, the brief effort on the part of the United States to take Sadat's peace initiative and to try to work with it. Détente for Egypt was a mixed bag. The June 1973 U.S.-Soviet communique on the relaxation of tensions, in fact, infuriated him. While he strongly preferred U.S. diplomatic intervention to end the diplomatic stalemate and thus relieve him of the necessity to go to war, the communique, he believed, would now not allow him to undertake the war that became necessary because of the absence of diplomatic movement. A relaxation of tensions between the superpowers in this respect would, in Sadat's view, reduce Egypt's value to both the United States and to the Soviet Union. Sadat's vision and his obstinacy when it came to his insistence on, quote, not 1 inch of Sinai remaining under Israeli control was to set the tone for the peace process that Hal and Bill have discussed earlier. Today, no Arab leader can accept less. The price Sadat paid for peace and the strategic relationship with the United States was quite high, even though the payoff was also quite high. He gained American financial and military assistance, but he lost about the equivalent amount of Soviet and Arab aid. Egypt and he personally were ostracized in the Arab world, and Egypt was stripped of both its formal leadership roles and much of its informal leadership roles, even until today in some respects. And of course, all of this combined with his authoritarian politics and the increasing unpopularity of his governance contributed to his assassination. What emerged from this beginning, however, changed the face of Egypt in fundamental ways. Over the next 30 years, during the period of hosni Mubarak's presidency, the United States-Egyptian partnership was grounded in four fundamental and mutually held strategic objectives. Foremost among them was the preserving and strengthening the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and trying to expand the focus of peace to include a comprehensive peace settlement. A second strategic objective, at least on the part of the United States, shared by Egypt, was to replace Soviet doctrine, arms, and training vis-a-vis the Egyptian military with American doctrine, arms, and training. In effect, creating an Egyptian military capability that could be interoperable with American military forces. Through 2012, the United States has provided Egypt with almost $42 billion worth of military aid, but has largely accomplished this military purpose. A test of the viability of this strategy came in 1991, when Egypt, as you recall, deployed 2 divisions to fight alongside the United States in the First Gulf War. The third strategic objective of the United States was to help revitalize the Egyptian economy. In the first instance, through the rehabilitation of Egypt's broken infrastructure. A major portion of the nearly $32 billion of economic assistance provided since that period has been devoted to repairing or reconstructing Egypt's water system, wastewater system, electricity network, telecommunications, as well as replacing the turbines in the Aswan Dam, which did not work when the Soviets installed them. We know that on the eve of the 2011 Egyptian revolution, the Egyptian economy was growing at a robust pace, an indication of the success of this third strategic objective. But we also know there was a fourth objective, which was not as successful, and that was to help Egypt move along a pathway that would contribute to more open governance, to the growing of a democracy culture, to the growing of democracy. And we know that was not successful. By the second decade of the 21st century, therefore, on the eve of the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, Egypt and the United States could point to a strategic relationship that had accomplished many of its major goals. It had weathered some significant storms, and it appeared resilient and flexible. Indeed, one could not help but recall the story, which is probably apocryphal, of the Soviet general who was asked in 1972 how he felt about having Soviet advisors kicked out of Egypt. And according to this apocryphal story, the Soviet general replied, "You know, we got 17 good years out of this relationship, not bad for a superpower vis-a-vis a small power." The United States in 2011 could say we were getting 31 years out of a relationship between a superpower and a smaller power. Given the focus of the conference, I won't spend much more time looking at the current situation, but some words need to be said. The relationship today between the United States and Egypt, the strategic relationship, is in some respects hanging by a thread, with accumulating anger in both Cairo and Washington over real, but mostly perceived policy and perceptual differences. The old bases of this relationship no longer suffice to surmount current problems. The Egyptian military may not feel it is as dependent as it was in the past on the United States for its continued modernization. Washington may no longer assess the tactical and logistical benefits of its military relationship with Egypt in the way it did in the past. The Egyptian economy, as strong as it was in January of 2011, has been in free fall since February of 2011. But the United States, now with limited resources and even more limited will, probably cannot extricate Egypt from this economic crisis. And as we know, especially over the past weeks, what looked like a potentially promising road to democratization in 2011 is now a road strewn with uncertainty. On the other hand, and paradoxically, little has changed with respect to the strategic bases which underlined this relationship in the past and which still, in fact, could underline this relationship. Because our mutual interests are essentially not changed, even if our policy differences have, in fact, grown. Egypt needs a strong military, given its own set of security concerns in Sinai, given tensions with Ethiopia with regard to the Nile Basin, the possibility of spillover from a still unstable situation in Libya, and the United States still needs a strong military relationship with Egypt, given the vagaries and uncertainties of places from which we are now withdrawing: instability in Iraq and likely instability in Afghanistan following the American withdrawal. And yet the divide between our two countries is widening, in large part over the direction of Egypt's future internal political system. For a majority of the Egyptian population and the military and its security services, the United States seemed to have thrown its weight behind the Muslim Brotherhood. And these sectors of the Egyptian population feared that the United States was prepared to support effectively the Islamicization of the largest Arab country. For its part, the United States has been unable to decide whether stability is more important than the possibility of democratic change. Washington points to the fact that the Brotherhood, through its political party, the Freedom and Justice Party, won every election that it contested in Egypt after 2011. But there's been vacillation in American policy. And there's been a penchant of American policymakers to talk about everything in public, thereby giving grist for the rumor mill in Cairo, which is still extraordinarily vibrant. This disconnect between hard interests, which we still share, and strong policy differences, which are now growing, is perplexing. The question for the future is going to be whether or not the two countries can find a renewed basis that uses the shared interests as a renewed base for building a political relationship in the future that can at least mirror the strategic relationship we've had in the past. We know from around the world that big power, small power relationships are always fraught with challenges. And the U.S.-Egyptian partnership has been no exception, even in the good years. Managing this relationship has taken diplomatic and political finesse, traits that both countries demonstrated amply between the late 1970s and 2 years ago. The rock-solid foundation, in my view, of shared interests has proved strong enough in the past to withstand many policy differences. The question for today is whether it will withstand future challenges in those same policy areas. Thank you.
The American trio will come back to speak about, or to say, what would they advise Secretary of State Kerry. But that will happen after the liquid break that we will have now for 15 minutes. Thank you very much.